We're going to continue reading A Day of Rest, chapter 22, the second half of the chapter today. And I'm going to just back up just one sentence to get us running and going on this. Turning to the sheriff, Doug continued, "Well, Floyd, are you courting Aunt Mary, or did you come to see me?" "If he came to court me, he's going about it mighty careful like," Aunt Mary broke in. "He brought 2 chaperones. 2 chaperones? Doug shook his head in disbelief. "Aunt Mary's powerful anxious to catch a man, Floyd, but I do think with her being so tiny, 1 chaperone would have been enough." "Aunt Mary, I'm sorry I got your hopes up." Floyd smiled, but he shook his head sadly. "But I rightly didn't come to court you. I just came along with those 2 revenue officers who are dead set on catching Douglas with some moonshine whiskey." "I hate to disappoint federal officers," Doug stated as he picked up the jars of milk and started toward the kitchen door. "I don't have any handy, and I'm too busy to make them any tonight. But if they want to search the place, bring them to the barn, and they can help me move the hay out of the loft." "Doug McTay, you ain't going to pitch hay on a Sunday," Aunt Mary demanded. "I won't be pitching hay on a Sunday if I can get out of it," Doug laughed as he pushed the screen door open with his shoulder. Doug let the door slam with a bang as he hurried across the porch to the cellar steps with the milk. Aunt Mary dropped the strainer into the dishpan and began washing it along with the buckets that had been used in the milking. The sheriff leaned against the kitchen table and waited. Everything looked and sounded okay, but he had a feeling that he was watching a first-rate play. Because he had brought the federal officers, he could expect some trickery by his cousin. Doug was saying the right things to go along with that idea. No doubt getting the hay out of the barn loft was just to give the law officers a workout. But somehow even the trickery seemed false. Doug wasn't worried by the revenue officers. That was certain. In fact, he seemed to be excited about something, almost laughing, he was so pleased with himself. Oh well, he had known from the start that there would be no whiskey in this house. Doug did not drink, and there wasn't the slightest rumor that he sold it. Floyd had tried to convince the agents they were wasting their time by searching Doug's place, but they had had a tip. Acting on the tip, they had taken the bull by the horns, and there was nothing for him to do as sheriff but to go along with them after they got the warrant. The tip had probably been given by one of Doug's friends as a joke, no doubt, but they had stumbled onto something. Aunt Mary was as nervous as a cat with kittens. Those feds would have had no idea how near they came to getting a belly full of lead by banging on a door at night that way, with the head of the house gone. But he knew his mountain women. Since the days of Daniel Boone, mountain women had held their homes against all kinds of enemies, while their menfolk were gone. No doubt the sag in the folds of that hot robe was caused by a gun, and that tiny woman would melt to the ground before she would give up, even though the gun was far too heavy to be of use to her. He could easily stop her before she got that gun into position. But what was going on that made her so nervous? Then, there had been altogether too much casualness about Bert's not being there at milking time. Doug was rather easygoing and might have overlooked the lapse for a time under the necessity of getting the milking done. But why was Bert lying there in Aunt Mary's bed as dirty as a pig? Usually, Aunt Mary would not have allowed the dirty boy in the house. Never would she have allowed him in her bed. Somehow, he had gotten into that bed without Aunt Mary's knowledge. And that didn't explain Bert. A 10-year-old mountain boy would rather be whipped than to sleep with a sister or an aunt. He would have slept in the hayloft first. Another odd thing, there were plates on the dining room table. The plates could have been set out there for breakfast, but he didn't think so. That kettle pulled back off the heat had food in it, food for supper. Something had happened before supper, and no one had eaten in this house. Something to do with Bert. There was no use questioning Doug or Aunt Mary. They would let him know if they wanted help from him, but they would evade any direct questions from the sheriff. With 2 hurried steps, Douglas crossed the porch and was back in the kitchen with the statement that the fearless law officers were now bravely facing the dangers of the smokehouse. "They'll be getting the meat dirty," Aunt Mary objected. "There's nothing out there except some salted pork belly," Doug countered. "It's strong enough this time of year to defend itself. Probably not as big as you are, Aunt Mary, but just as tough and just as strong." Douglas was laughing as he held his hand out toward Aunt Mary. "Now don't get all huffed up. I know the house is as safe with you here as with me. Safer, in fact. I'm not as apt to shoot to kill. But speaking of shooting, you have something on under that wool robe, I hope? Douglas McTay, how you talk, as if I'd go parading around the house naked." "I thought so. That's the reason the sweat keeps pouring down your face. That wool robe is too hot in this weather. You'll be having a heat stroke. Take it off. You won't need the gun with the sheriff here to protect us from the revenue officers." Douglas walked over to Aunt Mary and held out his hand expectantly. Reluctantly, Aunt Mary took the robe off and handed it to Douglas, who received it carelessly, making no effort to hide the stock of the gun protruding from the pocket before hanging it on a nail on the wall behind the kitchen stove. Aunt Mary moved slowly to the kitchen stool and let her breath out with a low moan as she sat down. The sheriff watched her with a frown on his face. "Doug, it's been a long day for Aunt Mary. Why don't you get Bert out of her bed and let her lie down until you get ready to have supper?" "I thought you was staying all night," Aunt Mary said caustically as Doug left the kitchen. "I thought maybe I'd better go down to the hen house and get some eggs for breakfast." Something had happened all right. The eggs hadn't been collected, as well as the cows hadn't been milked on time. A cow with a calf was always early for milking. Doug would have known something was wrong the instant he got to the barn and would have started walking after the cows immediately. That field where Doug kept the cows was only a 20-minute walk from the barn. If the gate to the cornfield had been fastened, Doug would have had it opened at the most in 25 minutes. Give him 20 minutes to get back to the barn with the cows. That would make the milking 45 minutes late. But something had made the milking over 2 hours late. The sheriff shook his head thoughtfully as he thought about Doug's car. It had not been in the garage when he had driven up with the officers. Doug would not have taken the car to look for cows in the cornfield, where he had kept them since he harvested the ears of corn. With the gate open as he kept it so the cows could get water, the cows might have been anywhere. Where did he go with the car right at milking time? Whatever had happened, it hadn't made Doug angry. If he had been angry, he wouldn't be looking like the fox that got into the chicken house. And that was the way Doug looked when he came back to the kitchen after he had made sure Aunt Mary lay down to rest. The sheriff shook his head again. Something was very odd indeed, but he probably would never know what caused that twinkle in those hazel eyes. That was the trouble with being sheriff. No one told you anything unless they wanted to make it official. And that's the end of chapter 22.